The eviction notice had been taped to her door for 3 days, before Wren finally peeled it off and folded it into her nursing bag, somewhere between a half-eaten granola bar and a stethoscope that had belonged to her mother. She didn't have the money. She wasn't going to have the money. That fact had settled into her chest like a stone she'd stopped trying to lift. The apartment on Decatur Street was a third-floor walk-up in a part of New Orleans that the tourism boards had stopped mentioning sometime in the 90s. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television at 2 in the morning. The hot water ran out in 11 minutes, which she'd timed, because Wren Calloway— no, not Calloway, that name was already taken in someone else's story. Because Wren Tate had learned early that the only things she could control were the small ones. She was 27 years old. She worked 12-hour night shifts at Mercy General in the cardiac unit. She ate peanut butter straight from the jar on bad nights and called it dinner. And she had not called her mother in 4 months, because her mother would hear the exhaustion in her voice and feel guilty, and Wren couldn't stand being someone else's guilt. The night it happened, she was walking home at 6:15 in the morning, still in scrubs, her hair half escaped from a braid she hadn't fixed since midnight. The streetlights on Magnolia were doing that thing they did in November, where the light turned everything a dull amber color that made the whole city look like an old photograph. She heard the sound before she saw the car. It was a black Mercedes S-Class, the kind of car that had no reason to be idling in front of a shuttered po' boy shop at 6 in the morning. The engine was running but wrong. That stuttering, labored sound she recognized the way a doctor recognizes a bad heartbeat. Something was seriously off. The man behind the wheel had the door open. He was crouched beside it, staring at the hood like he was waiting for it to explain itself. He wore a dark suit that cost more than 3 months of her rent, and his phone was pressed to his ear with the particular tightness of someone having a conversation that was not going well. Wren should have kept walking. She knew that. The rational thing, the safe thing, was to cross the street and not look twice at a man built like a wall in a suit that expensive at 6 in the morning in this neighborhood. Instead, she stopped. "It's your coolant," she said. The man lowered his phone. He turned and looked at her the way people look at things they don't expect to speak. He was maybe 40, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been carved with something deliberate. His eyes were the particular shade of gray that didn't look like a color so much as an absence of warmth. "Excuse me," he said, "your engine." Wren nodded at the hood. "It's running hot. You can hear it. That sound, like it's straining. If you keep driving it, you'll warp the cylinder head and then you won't be driving anything." She paused. "I grew up in my uncle's garage. I know what a car sounds like when it's about to fail." The man studied her for a moment. Not the way men usually studied her, calculating, measuring. This was something more like assessment, like he was looking at a variable he hadn't accounted for. "You're a nurse," he said. "Cardiac unit." "But cars and hearts have more in common than people think." She almost smiled. "Both of them tell you something's wrong before they quit. You just have to know how to listen." A beat of silence. Somewhere down the block, a pigeon landed on a power line. "Can you fix it?" he asked. Wren looked at the car, then she looked at her watch. Then she thought about the eviction notice folded in her bag, and the 12-hour shift she'd just finished, and the fact that her feet had been hurting since hour 3. "I can get you running," she said. "You're going to need a proper repair shop, but I can keep you from destroying the engine right now." She didn't ask his name. He didn't offer it. That was fine. She'd treated people in crisis for 4 years, and in crisis, names were often the last thing that mattered. The trunk of his Mercedes was stocked in ways that suggested someone who prepared for problems. A proper emergency kit, a gallon of distilled water, coolant concentrate. Wren pulled off her cardigan, she was wearing scrubs underneath, and got to work. She flushed the overflow reservoir, checked the hoses for cracks, found a slow leak at the lower radiator hose clamp, and tightened it with a flathead from the kit. She worked the way she worked in the cardiac unit, methodically, without drama, narrating quietly to herself. The man stood behind her and said nothing, which she appreciated. Most men with money felt the need to supervise things they didn't understand. It took 22 minutes. When she was done, she lowered the hood and stepped back. Her hands were dirty with engine grease, and she was suddenly aware that she was standing on a sidewalk in New Orleans at 6:40 in the morning looking like a disaster. "That should hold," she said. "Get to a mechanic today. Tell them about the clamp." She handed him back the flathead screwdriver. He took it without moving his eyes from her face. "What do I owe you?" Wren shook her head. "Nothing. I was walking by. You spent 20 minutes on someone else's car. That's not nothing. I'm a nurse," she said. "I spend 12 hours on people who can't pay me either." She picked up her bag from the sidewalk. "Have a good morning." She had gotten half a block away when she heard him. "Wren," she stopped, turned around slowly. He was still standing beside the car, phone in hand now, but not raised to his ear. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. "Your badge," he said, and he pointed at her chest, where her Mercy General ID was still clipped to her scrub top. "Wren Tate, RN, cardiac ICU." She felt her face go neutral in the way it did in the unit when something unexpected happened, and she needed a second to recalibrate. "Right," she said. "Well, good luck with the car." This time she kept walking. She thought about it twice in the next 3 days, which she told herself was not significant. Once when she was charting at 2 in the morning, and the unit was quiet in the particular way cardiac units get quiet. Not peaceful, exactly, just waiting. And once, when she was eating peanut butter out of the jar, and looking at the eviction notice she'd unfolded on the kitchen table because she needed to deal with it. She needed to actually deal with it, and instead she just looked at it until the letters stopped meaning anything. She'd grown up in a house where money was something that happened to other people. Her father had walked out when she was 9 and left behind 2 things: a 1987 Ford pickup truck with a cracked manifold, and a mother who made Wren feel that the only reliable currency in the world was skill. Things you knew how to do, things no one could take back. So she'd learned her uncle's garage, and then she'd learned biology, chemistry, anatomy. She'd worked her way through nursing school on a Pell Grant and 3 part-time jobs. She'd been competent at everything she did, and she had never, not once, expected someone to come after her with anything resembling a reward. Which was why what happened on the 4th day genuinely surprised her. She came off a night shift at 7 in the morning to find a man standing outside the employee exit of Mercy General. He was young, late 20s maybe, with a particular kind of stillness that wasn't relaxation. It was training. He was wearing a charcoal jacket and looking at his phone, and when she came through the door, he looked up and said her name, "Miss Tate." She stopped. "Yes, Mr. Sorrell would like to speak with you." He said it the way someone says something they know sounds strange, but have decided not to editorialize about. "Who is Mr. Sorrell?" The man, she would later learn his name was Brandt, looked at her with something that might have been appreciation. "The man whose car you fixed on Magnolia Street 4 days ago." Wren looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the parking lot. Then she thought about the eviction notice, and the fact that she hadn't slept in 14 hours, and the reasonable list of things she should do right now, which did not include getting into a car with a stranger. "Tell Mr. Sorrell that I'm glad the car is running," she said, "and that I need to sleep." She walked to the bus stop. He came himself the next morning. She was buying coffee at the place on Bourbon that opened at 6 and played Coltrane on the speakers, and she looked up from the counter and he was there. Different suit. Charcoal this time. No tie, but the same way of occupying space that he had on Magnolia Street. Like the room arranged itself around him without being asked. He sat down across from her without being invited. She let him because she was too tired to object, and also because she was curious, and she'd always been more honest about her curiosity than was probably strategic. "You didn't take my man's card," he said. "I didn't ask for a card. You could have." His eyes were steady on her face. "You clearly knew the car was worth something. I wasn't doing it because of the car." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "I was doing it because a machine was going to fail and I knew how to stop that." She paused. I'm the same way with people. Something shifted in his face, very slightly, like a window that had been cracked open half an inch. Sorel, he said. Matthias, Sorel. I know who you are, she said, because she did. She'd looked him up on the 4th day after the eviction notice. She'd found a name associated with import businesses, 3 LLCs she couldn't trace to anything concrete, and a reputation that moved through New Orleans the way weather moved. You knew it was coming before you could explain how. He didn't look surprised that she knew. He looked, if anything, slightly more interested. I have a proposition, he said. I'm a nurse, she said. Not a mechanic, not anything else. I know what you are. He leaned back in his chair. I also know you have 30 days before you lose your apartment on Decatur Street. I know you've been doing double shifts since September. And I know your mother is in Shreveport, and you haven't called her in 4 months because you don't want her to hear how tired you sound. The coffee shop played saxophone. A woman at the counter laughed at something on her phone. Wren kept her face very still. How do you know that? Because you helped me, he said, without being asked, without expecting anything back, and I don't take that lightly. She looked at him. What do you want? I have someone who needs medical attention. He can't go to a hospital. He said it plainly, without apology. It's not life-threatening. It's a wound that needs monitoring, antibiotics, and someone who won't report it. She should have stood up. She should have thanked him for the coffee and walked out into the morning and gone home to the apartment she was about to lose and called her mother and cried, which she had not let herself do in 11 months. She didn't. Show me the patient, she said. His name, she was told, was Crane. He was 43 years old and built like someone who had once been larger and had compressed himself inward over time. He had a gunshot wound, entrance and exit through the left side, missing the lung by what Wren calculated was about an inch. Someone had packed it with gauze and applied pressure and done a decent job, but the gauze was old, and the wound was warm, and she could see the beginning of what was going to be a significant infection if it wasn't addressed. When did this happen? She asked. 2 nights ago, Matthias said from the doorway. Why didn't you take him to a hospital? A pause. Crane is recognized. It would have complicated things. Wren did not ask what kind of things. She was already making a list in her head, the antibiotics she'd need, the type and dosage, the wound care protocol, the signs to watch for. This was what she did. When there was a problem in front of her, she didn't have the luxury of looking away from it. She worked for an hour. Matthias stayed in the doorway. He didn't hover or comment. He watched in the same way he'd watched her fix his car, with the concentrated attention of someone who understood what they were seeing without being able to replicate it. When she was done, she washed her hands in the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. She had just treated a man who had been shot in a house she couldn't name, for a man whose business she couldn't verify. She had done it because she couldn't look at a patient and walk away. She had done it the way she'd fixed the car, because the problem was there and she knew the solution, and walking away from a solvable problem felt like a kind of violence she wasn't capable of. But she wasn't naive. She knew the shape of the world she'd stepped into. She came back out. Matthias was still in the doorway. I'm going to need to come back tomorrow, she said. And the day after. That wound has to be watched for at least 5 days. He nodded once. I want something, she said. He waited. Not money. She met his eyes. The landlord on Decatur Street. I need 30 more days, that's it. 30 days so I can put together a deposit somewhere else. She paused. I'm not asking you to pay anything. I just need the pressure to stop so I can think. Matthias Sorel studied her for a long moment. She didn't know what he was calculating. She suspected it was something more complicated than she could see from the outside. Done, he said. She came back the next 4 days, and the day after that. Crane turned out to be a man of few words who played chess against himself on a travel board and occasionally made observations about the quality of local coffee that were more specific than she'd expected. On the 3rd day, he told her she had good hands. Nurse's hands, she said. No, he moved a knight. Hands that mean it. Different thing. She didn't ask what he meant. She thought she understood, Matthias was there every day for varying portions of her visits. Sometimes he was on the phone in another room. Sometimes he was in the kitchen with documents she didn't look at. Once he was gone entirely, and she sat with Crane for 2 hours, and they talked about New Orleans, in the way people do when they've both been there long enough to know it seems. She started to understand the shape of what Matthias Sorel was, without understanding the full extent of it. There were men in the house who called him something she couldn't always catch, a title or a name that functioned as one. There were calls he took outside. There was a quality to the deference people gave him that was different from the deference people gave hospital administrators or police captains. It was not institutional, it was personal, and it ran deeper. On the 6th day she came and the house was wrong. She felt it before she saw it. The quality of the stillness was off, too tight, like a wire pulled to its limit. 2 men she didn't recognize were in the front room. Brandt met her at the door and his face was doing something careful. "What happened?" she said. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She went to Crane's room and found him sitting up, his wound dressing partially removed, his face grey. "He tried to repack it himself," said a voice behind her. She turned. A man was standing in the corner of the room she hadn't registered yet, mid-40s, sandy-haired, a quality about him she didn't like immediately and couldn't fully explain. He was looking at Crane with an expression that hovered between concern and performance of concern. "Who are you?" she said. "Lyle." He smiled. It didn't reach the corners of his eyes. "Old friend of Matthias, just here to help. You helped by letting him remove his own wound dressing?" "I didn't know he'd done it until—" "Where's Matthias?" she asked Brandt. "Occupied," Brandt said carefully. She turned back to Crane and got to work. The wound was worse than she'd hoped, but better than she'd feared. Whoever had repacked it had done something. Just not enough and not right. She worked quietly, methodically, and kept one part of her attention on Lyle, because that was what her body was telling her to do. Crane caught her eye once while she was working. He looked at her, then looked at the corner where Lyle was standing. The look was brief and specific, the way patients in the cardiac unit sometimes looked at her when they needed to say something they couldn't say in front of family. She understood. When she finished, she stood and stretched her back and said, "I need to talk to Matthias. He's in a meeting," Lyle said. "This is a medical update," she said. "It's necessary." She found him herself. She knew the layout of the house by then. 6 days of arriving and leaving had given her a map she hadn't consciously assembled but had anyway. He was in the back room that looked out onto the courtyard, and when she knocked and came in, he looked up from a table covered in things she made a point of not seeing. She crossed the room and sat down across from him, which she could tell slightly surprised him, and she said quietly, "The man in your front room, Lyle Haverford. I don't know what he is to you, but Crane doesn't want him here." He didn't say it out loud, but he made it clear. She held his gaze. "I'm a nurse. I know what it looks like when a patient is afraid of someone in their room." Something went very still in Matthias Sorel's face. "Crane's been with me for 16 years, he said. His voice was even, but it had a quality that made the room feel smaller. "Then you should know when he's afraid," she said. He was looking at her with the same expression he'd had on Magnolia Street, like she was a variable he hadn't accounted for. But there was something else in it now. Something that was not entirely calculation. "What made you say this to me?" he said. "You could have walked out, left the medical update with Brandt." Wren thought about it. "Because you're the one who can do something about it," she said. And because... She paused and was honest because she'd been raised by a woman who thought dishonesty was a kind of weakness. "Because Crane has good hands too, and I don't like watching people with good hands be afraid." There was a silence that lasted long enough to become its own kind of communication. Then Matthias Sorel stood up and walked to the door and said something in a low voice to Brandt that she couldn't hear. She didn't ask what happened to Lyle Haverford. She heard him leave. That was enough. Crane recovered fully by day 9. She came one last time to do a final check, and he thanked her in the brief, specific way of someone who didn't deploy gratitude casually. She told herself it was over. She went home to the apartment on Decatur Street that she now had 30 more days in, and she did the math on a deposit for a place in mid-city that was farther from the hospital but had a working boiler, and she started to feel, for the first time in months, like the air in her lungs had a little more room to move. Matthias found her on a Tuesday evening. She was leaving the hospital and he was parked at the curb. Not blocking traffic, just there, like he'd arrived at exactly the right moment because he knew when the right moment was. "I want to talk to you," he said through the car window. She got in. She told herself later that she'd done it because she was tired of the bus. But that wasn't the whole truth. They drove for a while without speaking, which she'd come to understand was a thing he did. He let silences breathe instead of filling them. She looked out the window at the city going amber in the evening light and thought about how strange it was to be sitting in this car, this specific car that she'd fixed on a cold morning when she was exhausted and broke, and feel less afraid than she had in a year. "Lyle Haverford," he said, "was taking money from people who wanted information about my operations. He'd been doing it for 4 months." A pause. "I had suspected. I didn't have confirmation until what you told me." Crane's reaction. She absorbed this. "So I accidentally—" "You were paying attention," he said, "to something most people don't think is their job to pay attention to." He glanced at her. "That's not an accident." She looked at her hands. Clean now. No grease, no gloves, just the small scars from years of instruments and midnight procedures, and once a broken pane of glass in the garage when she was 14. "What did you do with him?" she asked. "He's no longer in New Orleans." She decided that was enough to know. "I want to offer you something," Matthias said. Properly this time. He drove with one hand on the wheel, easy, like a man who'd driven difficult roads and found this one uncomplicated. "My people, my family, need medical care that can't always go through official channels, not because we're reckless, because we live in a way that creates certain exposures." He chose his words carefully but not evasively. "I want someone on retainer, someone with your skills and a brief pause, your particular way of being in a room." Wren looked out the windshield. The bridge over the bayou was lit gold. "That's a complicated thing you're asking," she said. "Yes, I'd have to keep my job at the hospital. I'm not giving that up. I'm not asking you to. And I'm not," she searched for the word, "I'm not an enforcer. I'm not going to be present for things I don't need to be present for. I'm medical. That's the line. That's the line I'm asking you to hold," he said. She thought about her mother. She thought about what her mother had told her once, when Wren was 17, and angry at the smallness of their life. "The world is going to try to put you in a box. You pick the box or the box picks you." She thought about Crane moving a chess piece with careful hands. She thought about the eviction notice, and then she thought about how she'd stopped thinking about the eviction notice once she had something real to do with her hands. "Okay," she said, "but I have a condition. Tell me." "The apartment on Decatur." She turned to look at him. "Don't touch the landlord. Don't arrange anything. I'm going to sort it myself with the extra income." She paused. "I need to know that what I have came from what I did, not from someone fixing it for me." Matthias Sorrell drove in silence for 3 seconds. Then he said, "All right." It wasn't an easy answer. She could see it wasn't. A man like him fixed things. It was probably a reflex by now, the way she packed wounds without thinking. But he said it, and she believed him, and that was something. The day the case against Lyle Haverford's contact broke, she heard about it 6 weeks later, through Brandt, in the oblique way Brandt communicated things. She was in the middle of a 12-hour shift. A man had come in through the hour with a rhythm that looked wrong on the monitor and turned out to be a rare supraventricular tachycardia that 3 other nurses had called benign. She caught it. She always caught it, the attending said. "Good eye, Tate," she said. "Thank you." And she went back to charting. And the night rolled on, and somewhere across the city Matthias Sorrell was doing whatever he did with the information she'd given him 6 weeks ago, which had unlocked something she didn't fully understand, and which she'd decided was not entirely hers to understand. What she understood was this. She had walked down Magnolia Street in the amber light of a November morning. too broke and too tired to do anything sensible. And she had stopped because a machine was failing and she knew how to fix it. She had not done it for money. She had not done it because she expected anything back. She'd done it because walking away from a solvable problem had always felt to her like a kind of giving up she wasn't built for. And somehow, in the way that the most significant things in her life had always arrived sideways, through a cracked window rather than a front door, that refusal to give up had walked her into the most complicated, the most dangerous, and the most alive she had felt in years. She went home at 7:15. She walked past the apartment on Decatur Street. She'd moved to Mid-City 2 weeks ago, but the old route was still in her feet, and looked up at the third-floor window where she'd spent 2 years watching the streetlights go amber. She wasn't afraid anymore. That wasn't the same as safe. She knew that, but it was something.